Um, so, as Suzanne said, I work at the National Co-ordinating Centre for Public Engagement. We were set up 8 years ago, and just walking up this street to come here, I was having memories of 8 years ago. I first met Suzanne because Manchester was one of the beacons for public engagement, and Anna and the museum was sort of part of the story, and MMU and Salford, and it was a really exciting 4 years trying to kind of understand how can we make public engagement much more importantly kind of embedded into universities and particularly into their research. A few years later, this thing called the REF arrived, and I think I was very pleased that in the REF there was a strong encouragement, but slightly muddled encouragement perhaps, for people to submit case studies that accounted for the impacts arising from public engagement with research. And frankly, that got a lot of people knocking on our door at the National Centre saying, what is this thing called public engagement? It's obviously important because you can do it in the REF. And so a lot of people who'd never really taken public engagement particularly seriously did start to show a real interest in it. So the REF took place, and 6,600 or so case studies are available on a database. If you are interested, you can go and browse and search those case studies and find all kinds of interesting examples of public engagement. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about what we've found, because we've spent quite a lot of time looking at them. Interestingly, the REF is currently being planned for 2021. There's going to be another REF, and earlier, in the middle of last year, a review was commissioned by the government from somebody called Lord Stern, who took a kind of independent view of what's good about the REF and what are the issues. On the whole, I think it was a kind of positive sense that this is worth doing and it's worth doing again. He made quite a few recommendations, for instance, that the ways in which impact are defined were a little bit too linear and narrow and should be opened up. He raised some questions about the negative impact of the REF on the quality of partnership working between universities and external organisations. And much to our delight, he talked about impacts on public engagement and understanding needed to be more clearly sort of encouraged and the guidance improved. And that's been picked up in a consultation that's currently live on the HEFCE website. Until March the 17th, there's about 40 questions. You could spend many hours looking at those. But one of those questions, I think it's number 23, shows how much of a REF nerd I've become, invites you to submit your ideas about how the guidance around public engagement could be improved. And we are definitely going to submit some ideas. So before we start looking at some case studies, just a quick summary of some of the things we found when we opened the box of the 6,640 case studies, searched them, used various search terms to kind of see how many kinds of public engagement were featuring in which panels, how were people using the term public engagement, how were they defining impacts arising from it, to what extent did they take on board the guidance or not. We found many interesting things, and we have a 100-page report that will be launched at the beginning of March for those of you who really want to get into the detail. Just some of the headlines. If you just look for the phrase public engagement, you'll only find about 700 case studies, but if you use a range of terms like engaging with the public, community engagement, etc., it reveals a much richer picture. And we discovered about 3,100 of the case studies make some reference to some kind of engagement with the public. We noticed that nearly always the public engagement is focused on changes to understanding and awareness. It's much more kind of conceptual in terms of people's learning and understanding, much less focused on kind of more instrumental outcomes. So it seems that there's a paradigm of public engagement as going out and talking about your research and getting people to think about it, rather than trying to kind of concretely engage the public in influencing, say, the public sphere, the environment, or the products and services that they consume. So an interesting, I think, an interesting opportunity to widen our imaginations when we think about what public engagement is good for. I think it's fair to say the third bullet point, the evidence provided of impact on public understanding and awareness, although lots of people claimed that they'd done it, they didn't often convincingly explain what had changed. And we also looked, you don't know the scores of all of the case studies because they haven't published them, but they do tell you if a department scored all 4-star or all 3 and 4-star. So when we looked at those, what we discovered is that those case studies that included public engagement scored pretty much the same as those that didn't. And I think there was a kind of a little narrative going around that actually public engagement case studies would be scored lower, and they were second best. And certainly our attempt to get to the bottom of that suggested that wasn't the case. So those are just a few of the headlines. But what we did, as well as trying to sort of make sense of how public engagement featured, was also try to look at, well, what makes a good case study that talks about engaging the public? So here are some of the ideas that I want to share with you. And the first, I think, for those of you who've been thinking about public engagement for a long time, you won't be surprised that being precise about who you mean when you talk about the public really helps. Some case studies just we engage the general public. But I think those case studies that were doing a much more interesting job tended to be much more precise about who they were engaging with. Now you'll notice I'm using a dramatic stroke filmic metaphor here because a case study is a story, actually. It is not a list of data. It is actually telling a story about what happened. And good case studies have a really strong story to tell. And they take you on a journey, and the links in the chain on that journey give you real confidence that what they're claiming in terms of the evidence is credible. So how do you tell a good story about public engagement is the second thing we'll look at. And then the third thing we will look at is, can we identify some good practice in terms of evidencing impact? And clearly this is not something we can address in great depth today because it's a very subtle art, the art of evaluation. And I know that Suzanne is one of the leading experts on that very topic, and I'm sure runs wonderful training about that. So we can allude to that today, but we're not going to get to the bottom of it, so don't get too excited. Okay, so I'm going to start with the cast and just sort of reflect back to you. When we looked at the case studies, as I say, we found lots that talked about the public, but we also found a lot that were much more precise about their publics. And in a minute, I'll give you some hooks to look at. And then what we're going to do is on your table, you'll notice a little pack of 4 case studies. I'm afraid that the text is a little small in the spirit of trying to save paper. But there are 4 case studies that are going to form the bedrock of your engagement in this session. You're going to choose one of them, and you're going to look at it with a colleague, because it's always much more interesting to do it in a couple or a 3. And you're going to sort of reflect on what you can pick from that case study. The first one from main panel A was from the University of Edinburgh, and it was looking at patient, policymakers, educators, and the public's understanding of stem cell research. The second one is from the University of Southampton, from the Oceanography Department, a hardcore public engagement case study. They don't come much more full-on public engagement than this. This is all about public engagement. The first one has aspects of engagement, but it's also interested in policy and practitioner and educator engagement. The second one is all about how the Department of Oceanography at Southampton have built over a number of years a really sort of sustained strategic approach to engagement. The third has a strong focus on public engagement, again from the University of Birmingham, and it's work on a project called the Open Air Laboratories that was funded by the Big Lottery Fund, but involved a huge amount of citizen science. And the final one is a rather charming project from Southampton of a choir of nuns trying to get inside the meaning and significance of medieval music. and using really interesting participative approaches to that. So those are the four, and in a minute you're going to choose one of them. What I'm going to ask you to look for when you read them is how those case studies have framed the people who were involved in the engagement. And when you look, we've offered this just as a starting point. Who is out there? Who is outside the university that you could, how could you meaningfully describe all of the wonderful people who you might engage with? And I think a lot of the case studies work with people in their sort of professional capacities. So that could be with business, with policy, with civil society, or with people working in professional practice. There are many ways you might cut it, but that for us is a reasonably coherent way of looking at it. And lots of case studies will be about engagement with Westminster around policy or with local government. Some are very focused just in the business sphere. Some very focused on working, say, with practitioners in the health service, and some working with civil society through charities, community associations, etc. What's interesting is, so where do the public fit? And our way of representing it is, if we think, for instance, about business. Many case studies talked about engaging with businesses, but they also talked about engaging with the public when they were talking about that engagement. And in that case, they talked about the public as customers or consumers or employees or audiences, but they were thinking about the public in relation to their consumption of or relationship with businesses. And here's just an example of Dr. Walmsley, whose numerous studies relating to the concept of corporate social responsibility related to tourism and hospitality. The purpose of the research was to inform consumers about the impacts of tourism, influence their selection of hotel groups, and investigate different corporate policies and practices. So he'd identified a very clear role within which he wanted the public to engage with his research. When you think about policy, citizens, voters, sort of thinking about people in their kind of civic roles within a democracy often. So here's an example. Southampton research has led to the UK public data principles enshrined in the government white paper, providing access to 10,000 government data sets. The open data sets approving means for strong citizen engagement. So here, in terms of engaging in the sort of policy space, they're engaging with the public as citizens. In terms of civil society, I think a really strong focus around communities of place, people who live in a particular area, or communities of interest, people who share a particular passion or a particular medical condition, bringing people together around a topic that's really pertinent and relevant to them. Often they talk about volunteers or about people as members of families, etc. The two examples, UPSI's work is provide an evidence base about how to engage effectively with communities, and Galaxy Zoo is looking at engaging people as volunteers in citizen science. And finally, professional practice, unsurprisingly, patients, students, pupils, service users comes up a lot, but here, where there's really interesting work going on between the researchers, say, and health practitioners, but very active engagement of patients in that conversation, perhaps to contribute to the research, but certainly also to make sure that patients are engaged in the findings from that research and its implications and relevance for them. So I think that idea is a starter for 10. It's derived from the case studies. These are the kinds of terms that people are using to talk about the public. And frankly, when they talk about them in that more differentiated way, it feels, I think, a bit more convincing than when they just talk about them generically. So that's top tip number one, is to think about being as precise as possible about who you're engaging with. And I think in the guidance to the ref, there is a helpful, there are helpful terms that they've used called reach and significance, which is trying to sort of help you with that, because they don't, by reach, they mean the kind of breadth. So that could be, thousands and thousands of people weighed up against a case study which maybe only reached 10 people. But the other category they offer at the same time is significance, which is to say that those thousands of people may have had a relatively insignificant encounter compared with the 10 people who might have had a really profound, life-changing experience. And what they're trying to say is both are okay. So don't be frightened of small reach if you can provide compelling evidence of a really significant search. Some, like case study in panel A, identified some target publics, but also policymakers and practitioners, etc. And public engagement often was blended with other forms of engagement and was none the worse for that. In fact, often made a really significant contribution, but didn't carry the full weight of the case study. So in lots of cases, public engagement is one aspect of a range of very focused sort of interactions with people outside academia. And I think they were very impressive case studies too. Okay, shall we move on to the next challenge, which is a bit harder. And this is about the storylines, the plots that people were telling, because I think, Sheena, you just said a minute ago, it was a bit inconsistent, it was a bit muddled. Lots of case studies, when you read them, you don't really know what was the point. Why did this matter? And I think a good case study is really confident about what it is about and why it matters that we did this. And so I'm going to offer you 3 storylines that we found coming up again and again. Now, there's a book called The 7 Basic Plots, if any of you are interested, which basically says that any story basically aligns with one of 7 archetypes of what happens in the world. We've gone one better, and we've decided there's only 3 when it comes to public engagement. And, you know, that strange little diagram on the top right is what's called the story arc, the narrative arc. Stories follow certain conventions. There's an exposition that kind of draws you in. There's a kind of rising action as the tension mounts. You may be going up and down as the tension mounts, and then there's a little resolution, and then it goes up again. And then there is a climax, and then a falling action and a kind of really profound sense of relief. Either that, thank God that's over, or wow, wasn't that amazing, and I've taken something really powerful from it. I'm not suggesting for a minute that ref impact case studies should emulate Hollywood blockbusters, but there is some value, I think, in thinking, am I telling a good story? So in a minute, you're going to look at these case studies and see if you think they are. And I'm going to get you to look at one storyline first. And this is the dominant narrative around public engagement that comes up again and again and again in different forms. But it's about enlightenment and empathy. It's about the ways in which research generates powerful new knowledge and meanings. That's what we do in universities. We distill new ways of making sense of the world. And through public engagement, that knowledge is brought into the public sphere. It animates conversation. It inspires learning, reflection, and empathy. And it circulates new ways of making sense of a complex, ever-changing world. That comes up again and again, particularly in panel D. I think lots and lots of stories about bringing fresh insights into the world and helping people think a little differently. But also the empathy side of it. It isn't just an intellectual kind of contact that you're having. Often it's really touching people's understanding of themselves, their difference from others, etc. So here's just one example from the panel, the history panel. The politics of memory, changing how Spain's recent history is perceived. So that thing, changing how people perceive the history of Spain. Professor Paul Preston's work on the causes, course, and long-term legacy of the Spanish Civil War has significantly influenced developments and activities in 3 areas: civil society, supporting the activities of NGOs and civic associations working to quantify, catalogue, and commemorate the victims of the Francoist repression, thus contributing to processes of collective commemoration and memorialization. So if you're a physicist, you might be thinking, I don't quite get that language, say. I'm not saying that physicists wouldn't understand that. I'm not trying to be rude about physicists. I'm trying to say that different disciplines have different languages and different ways of framing what they do. This is classic history. And that's okay, because the people who are reading these case studies are historians. and people who work in heritage, so they kind of get it. So it's okay to be relatively, you could say, to use a certain amount of jargon. The second point, public discourse, stimulating public debate in Spain, the UK and other countries over the historical origins of key political divisions within present-day Spain. So really helping people argue and get to grips with what happened. And education, stimulating awareness within the educational sector of Spain's recent violent past. So very much about moving new ideas into the educational sphere, into public discourse, into supporting people to make sense of, to remember the past. So in terms of how those stories tend to get told, a story needs a strong motivation. And I think, why do people do those sorts of public engagement activities? They're trying to make the research as meaningful as possible to people outside academia. So they're looking for ways to connect that work. And they're often trying to make that work persuasive so that people really engage with it, take it on board, and that something goes on in their heads or their hearts as they kind of process and make sense of that. And so typically stimulating learning, influencing public debate, changing understandings, challenging conventional wisdom, challenging professional orthodoxies, these kind of mind-forged manacles that we all assume, and then suddenly somebody says, think about it like this, and suddenly everything reconfigures, and fostering empathy. And it's interesting, the chairman of the Arts Council, who's resigning from the role to move on, is just publishing a book tomorrow called The Empathy Charter, or something along those lines. His kind of takeaway from spending 4 years at the helm of the Arts Council is the most significant thing that the arts can do is actually to foster empathy between people, which is a really interesting take. So that's typically, you'll see those sorts of phrases coming up. Typically media, websites, debates, databases, etc. And in terms of the payoff, I think people will often talk about enlightenment, inspiring wonder, curiosity, learning, meaning-making, empathy. But it's not all about kind of just getting people to sort of understand things better. I think there's also an edge to it sometimes in terms of criticism, provoking challenge or scrutiny or debate or holding people to account. So it can be quite edgy and quite tough, as well as really life-enhancing. We've been looking sort of retrospectively at the case studies people wrote, and it's quite easy to critique them. I think a lot of people would say, well, we didn't know there was going to be a ref, so we didn't put in place any kind of evaluation or evidence capture, and we scrabbled together what the best scraps that we could. But I don't think there's any excuse looking forward to thinking about potential pathways to impact for the work that you're doing, and talking to people like Suzanne and others about appropriate evaluation methods that you might begin to put in place to begin to explore the extent to which you are realizing those objectives. So I think switching it from looking backwards to looking forwards, I suggest these frameworks are really useful devices for you to do your planning, as well as, to act as prompts to read case studies. So you should, I think, be looking ahead now. The ref is in 2021. It's a tremendous opportunity, I think, to think about really creative methods to realize your objectives and to put in place some realistic forms of evaluation that will give you the edge over your competitors